My name is John. I welcome you to another interesting video. We are all about purity and holiness. And this video you are watching right now, just watch to the end. You're going to be blessed. And I want you to just share your testimony in the comment section and let me hear from you.
Addiction is a process that you initiate in your mind, in your brain. And there's something called the principle of neuroplasticity. The principle of neuroplasticity has like 10 principles thereabouts. The first principle is use it or lose it. Use it or lose it means that when you begin to use, mind you, the brain has several neural pathways. Everything we do, they are being controlled by neural pathways in the brain. So addiction as well is a learning process that once you initiate it, there will be a neural pathway in your brain that sponsors and that powers that behavior. So when you start watching porn, take for example, there'll be a neural pathway in your brain activated for that behavior. So the first time you watch pornography, you may not enjoy it that much, or you may not feel controlled by it. You could decide to stop it at will. The next time you do it, you are strengthening, you are reinforcing the neural pathway in your brain responsible for pornography. And as you keep doing it, the neural pathway in your brain becomes fortified. And it gets to a point whereby it hijacks your will. You start beginning to watch pornography by default, subconsciously. It takes over just the way a virus takes over the central processing unit of a computer. So that neural pathway takes over your emotions. It conditions how you feel per time. It conditions your desire. It takes over your will. That is what the Bible calls strongholds. They take over your mind. So that is how addiction begins. In more scientific terms, let me say that when you engage in an addictive behavior, take for example, you watch pornography, there is a chemical that will be released in your brain. The name of the chemical is called dopamine. Personally, I call dopamine the sweet hormone. It's that hormone that is released, that neurotransmitter that is released in your brain that makes you feel good, makes you feel high, satisfied, and all that. So when you watch pornography, the level of dopamine that is released in your brain is always 10 times more than the quantity of dopamine that is released in normal activities. Oh yes, there are activities that triggers the release of dopamine. Normal life-sustaining activities are associated with dopamine release, like eating, drinking, if you're married, sleeping with your wife and all those things. In all those normal life-sustaining activities, God has done it in such a way that there is a surge of dopamine in your mind. You feel good eating, you feel good drinking, you feel good sleeping with your wife. So that dopamine gives you a kind of satisfaction so that you can be motivated to do it over and over and over again. And this is why we don't get tired of eating, we don't get tired of drinking, we don't get tired of life-sustaining activities. However, when you go to the point of watching pornography, taking alcohol and all that, the level of dopamine that is released in your brain is 10 times higher than the level of dopamine released in some of these normal life-sustaining activities. Now, the implication of that is that nothing will satisfy you again because your own standard for pleasure has been skyrocketed. So now you eat, you don't get satisfied. Everybody is playing, enjoying, catching fun around you. You are bored. You are not enjoying what people are doing. You see alcoholic, they stop eating because eating does not get it there. It doesn't get them to that level of that threshold that they've set in their mind. They don't want to play with people. They isolate themselves. So the only thing that satisfies them is alcohol, is porn, is sex. That I've meditated on the scriptures, read books, gone for deliverance. I've confessed my sins, but I still keep falling into this sin over and over and over again. So at that point, I realized that this thing called addiction is deeper than what we think. It's not just a spiritual problem. There must be something about it. So, by the privilege of my career as a medical doctor, I delved into another kind of training, and I began to study and I began to study. And that was when I realized that addiction is not a sin. Addiction is a sickness of the mind. And let me clarify that. If you watch pornography, if you have sex with a prostitute, that is a sin. But that thing in your mind that makes you always do it, that makes you unable to stop doing it, is what we call addiction. And that is a sickness. It is not a sin. So, for you to effectively come out of the problem called addiction, you must separate the sin from the sickness. All you have to do to come out of a sin is to confess it. All right. But if you do not deal with the sickness of addiction, you still keep going back into the sin. You see, the Bible says something, said, confess your faults one to another so that you might be healed. KJV translation says, confess your faults. Right? And I really connect to that translation of the Bible, because earlier verse talks about if any man is sick, let him call the elders of the church, let them pray for him. Then he says, if he has committed a sin, he shall be forgiven him. So what a sinner needs is forgiveness. The problem of a sinner is that he has deviated from the patterns of God, and all he needs is to be forgiven. So the next verse says, confess your fault. No, that was not talking about sin, because he already addressed the sin issue earlier. He said, confess your fault one to another so that you can be healed. He didn't say so that you can be forgiven. So when a machine is faulty, you take it to a mechanic to fix it. So the same thing applies. Addiction is a fault